Wait outside. This is family business. Those were my mother's exact words, spoken in a hallway outside a locked conference room, 30 minutes before my grandmother's will was read. She said them the way she'd said them my whole life, calm, certain, already assuming I would fold. I didn't argue. I just turned toward the elevator. That was when the attorney opened the door himself and said one word that changed everything. No. If you've ever been treated like an afterthought by people who called themselves your family, stay with me. This story doesn't end where you think it will. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see how this one plays out. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 34 years old. I spent 20 years being the daughter nobody expected much from, in a family that had already decided who mattered. That changed the day a sealed envelope, a locked door, and my grandmother's handwriting rewrote every assumption my family had ever made about me. My grandmother was Ruth Callahan. She built Callahan Freight Solutions from a single lease truck and a folding table in her garage into a regional logistics company with 4 terminals across the Pacific Northwest and just under 200 employees. She used to say the business ran on 2 things, fuel and honesty was harder to keep in supply. My mother, Linda, became the company's chief financial officer when I was still in middle school. My father, Gerald, ran operations as director of terminal logistics. My older brother, Trevor, was made vice president of business development before he turned 30, a title my grandmother once joked was generous. I took a different path. I worked as a compliance auditor for a regional trucking co-op, the kind of job that involves cross-checking manifests, fuel logs, and driver hour reports for federal violations. It is unglamorous work. It is also work built entirely on the idea that numbers do not lie, even when people do. My mother called it a very responsible little job. Trevor called me the paperwork police at every family dinner where he wanted a laugh. Nobody in my family ever called it a career. The favoritism was never a single dramatic moment. It was smaller than that, and it built for 20 years. When Trevor turned 16, our parents bought him a used pickup truck outright. When I turned 16 2 years later, I was told I could use the family car on weekends if Trevor didn't need it first. When Trevor's rent fell behind during a slow sales quarter in his late 20s, my father quietly covered 4 months of it and called it a bridge loan, one that was never repaid and never mentioned again. When my apartment building raised my rent by $200 the same year, my mother told me that was just what adulting looks like. And at every company holiday party for a decade, Trevor stood beside my grandmother in the photograph that ran in the regional business journal. I was usually the one holding the extra coats. My father was the one who let it happen. He wasn't cruel. He simply never disagreed with my mother in front of anyone, and he treated peace in the house as more important than fairness in it. If I ever pointed out a double standard, he'd say, "Your mother has her reasons," as if that answered anything. I used to tell myself it was temporary, that once I proved myself, once I had a title that sounded impressive enough at dinner, the imbalance would even out. I spent years waiting for a version of myself my family would finally take seriously. It never occurred to me that the person actually watching and keeping score was my grandmother. There was a particular Sunday I still think about. Trevor had closed a mid-size regional account and my mother turned it into a small production. A card, a bottle of wine, a toast at dinner. Nobody mentioned that the deal had barely broken even. Because Trevor had promised expedited delivery timelines the terminal crews couldn't realistically sustain without paying massive overtime. I knew because I'd seen the freight numbers through a friend at the co-op who cross-checked shipments for a neighboring carrier. When I mentioned it quietly to my father, he told me not to make things complicated during a celebration. That was the pattern. Trevor's wins were celebrated loudly. My observations were treated as inconvenient noise that threatened to spoil a nice evening. About 2 years before she died, Grandma Ruth started inviting me to her house on Wednesday evenings. Officially, it was to help her get used to the new accounting software. In practice, she'd hand me printouts, vendor invoices, mileage logs, fuel purchase reports, and ask me strange specific questions. Does this vendor code look duplicated? Why would a fuel expense rise the same month deliveries dropped? Would your system flag an invoice that gets approved twice under 2 different project numbers? I thought she was just lonely and liked having someone to talk shop with. I answered every question the way I would for a compliance audit, because that was the only way I knew how to answer anything. I didn't understand until much later that she wasn't testing a software system. She was testing whether I could see what she was starting to suspect she was seeing. Grandma passed in March. After a short illness she'd mostly kept private. The funeral was small and quiet, and for a few days my family behaved like a family. Then the will reading was scheduled, and everything reverted to form. I arrived at the law office 10 minutes early. My mother was already in the hallway outside the conference room, standing in front of the closed door like a checkpoint. My father sat in a chair against the wall, studying the carpet. Trevor leaned against the window, adjusting his cufflinks, wearing the expression of someone who already believed the outcome was decided in his favor. "Wait outside," my mother said, before I'd even set down my bag. "This is family business." I actually laughed because for a second I thought I'd misheard her. I had spent 2 decades doing the invisible work of that family, coordinating funeral arrangements for 2 great-aunts, organizing every holiday dinner since I was 22, driving 4 hours each way every time Grandma needed a ride to a hospital appointment my mother was too busy to take her to. And now, apparently, showing up for the reading of her will made me an outsider. "Fine," I said, because arguing with my mother in a hallway has never once changed her mind, and there's a particular relief in not giving people the satisfaction of watching you beg. I turned toward the elevator. That was when the office door opened. The attorney, a calm, gray-haired man named Daniel Reyes, stepped out and looked directly at me. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you're needed inside." My mother's hand came off the door handle like it had been burned. Trevor's smirk faltered. My father actually stood up. Inside, Daniel explained that my grandmother had left explicit written instructions. The substantive terms of her estate could not be read aloud unless every named beneficiary was physically present, and if any of us tried to exclude another, the reading would be postponed indefinitely pending a formal inquiry into why. My mother's objection died in her throat before she could finish it. Daniel opened a sealed envelope, unfolded several pages and began to read. The first line wasn't sentimental. It was a warning, addressed to whoever might be trying to keep someone out of that room. My mother went very still. And that was the moment I understood. My grandmother hadn't just prepared a will. She had prepared for exactly what my mother tried to do in that hallway. Daniel told us later that the attendance clause hadn't always existed in that form. My grandmother had amended it 3 weeks after her final private meeting with my mother, a meeting none of the rest of us had known about. Whatever was said in that meeting, it had been enough for my grandmother to conclude that someone in this family might try to keep me out of a room that legally required me in it. She had been right. What none of us knew, what my mother, my father, and my brother had absolutely no idea about, was that 8 months before she died, my grandmother had quietly hired an independent forensic accounting firm to review Callahan Freight Solutions books. Not the internal audit team my mother oversaw. An outside firm with no connection to the company, reporting directly and only to her. She had also restructured her ownership. Grandma Ruth had held 60% of Callahan Freight Solutions through a family holding entity. Rather than dividing that stake equally among her children and grandchildren the way everyone assumed she would, she placed a majority of the voting shares into a new oversight trust. And she had named an initial trustee with full voting authority for a 12-month review period. That trustee was me. Not because I had asked for it, campaigned for it, or even suspected it was possible. Because for 2 years in a kitchen over printouts and coffee, I had answered every question she asked me honestly, and I had never once told her what she wanted to hear instead of what the numbers actually showed. She hadn't been teaching me accounting software. She had been quietly deciding who in this family could be trusted with the truth when it was inconvenient. Nobody in that conference room knew any of this yet. They were about to. Before I tell you what happened when my mother realized what my grandmother had actually done, make sure you're subscribed because the calmest thing I did that year is also the thing that changed everything. The will named an independent governance attorney to chair a formal internal review of Callahan Freight Solutions within 10 business days. As the interim voting trustee, I had 2 responsibilities during that window: preserve the company's records exactly as they stood, and ensure nobody with something to hide got a chance to alter them first. I didn't yell. I didn't confront anyone in that conference room. I did the thing I actually know how to do, the thing my family had spent 20 years mocking as small and unglamorous. I called the forensic accounting firm my grandmother had already retained, confirmed their engagement was still active under the estate, and formally authorized them to expand their review under the trust's authority. I requested that the company's IT administrator, a longtime employee named Priya who had known my grandmother for 15 years and trusted her completely, freeze administrative edit access to the accounting system's historical entries, effective immediately, pending the review. I sent a short, factual notice to the current CFO, my mother, informing her that all vendor payment approvals above a modest threshold would require trust sign-off starting that day, per the terms of the estate. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't need to. I simply made it so that whatever had happened in that company's books over the last several years could no longer be quietly cleaned up before anyone got a chance to look at it properly. My mother called 4 times that evening. I let each call go to voicemail, and then I listened to all 4 back-to-back at 11 at night sitting alone in my kitchen. Her tone moved from irritated to bewildered, to something close to panic by the 4th message. Maya, this is absurd. You don't understand how the business runs. Call me back. I didn't call back. I forwarded the voicemail transcripts to the trust's independent counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Melissa Grant, because I had learned enough from my grandmother's example to know that documentation, not arguments, was the only thing that would matter in the coming weeks. 2 days later, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding a folder. Inside was a proposed private settlement. I would voluntarily step down as trustee, and in exchange she and my father would personally pay me a lump sum once probate closed, and Trevor would guarantee me a small, non-voting stake in the company. I looked at the offer for a long moment. You're offering to buy Grandma's decision back from me, I said. I'm trying to protect this family from a mess, she said. Then why isn't the company paying this? Why is it coming out of your personal accounts? She didn't have an answer for that. I slid the folder back across the table. If there's nothing to find, I told her, then the review will prove that faster than any settlement will. At the door she paused and said, Trevor has relationships you don't understand. If his reputation takes a hit, the whole business suffers. I told her maybe his reputation should depend on what he actually did. She looked at me for a long moment. You've changed, she said. I told her I hadn't. She was just finally dealing with the version of me that knew how to say no. The formal governance meeting took place 9 days later, not at my grandmother's house, not at a family dinner table, but in the company's own training room under fluorescent lights, with a projector displaying transaction records instead of family photographs. Nobody could soften what was coming with childhood memories in a room like that. The independent accountants had been thorough. They walked the room through 18 months of vendor payments to a marketing and logistics consulting firm called Pinnacle Partners Group, a vendor Trevor had personally championed and repeatedly renewed without competitive bidding. Of the 51 invoices reviewed, 17 contained line item descriptions nearly identical to earlier invoices, several billed for client development travel, on dates when no client meetings appeared on any calendar, and one invoice for $22,000 covered an industry conference that, according to the conference's own registration records, Pinnacle had never actually attended. Pinnacle handled a lot of relationship work that doesn't always show up on a calendar, Trevor said, arms crossed. You don't understand how sales works. The accountant clicked to the next slide. Bank records, obtained through proper legal process once the review escalated, showed a portion of Pinnacle's payments routed onward to a smaller entity called TCB Consulting. Trevor's full name was Trevor Callahan Bennett. His attorney told him to stop talking. He didn't listen right away. You investigated my personal finances because Grandma had a grudge, he snapped, looking at me. Grandma didn't create the bank transfers, Trevor, I said. You did. You've wanted this your whole life, he said. You were always jealous of me. I almost laughed. I wanted a seat at Thanksgiving that wasn't at the far end of the table. You apparently wanted a shell company. His attorney physically put a hand on his arm. One of the independent board members, a retired logistics executive named Frank Okafor who had known my grandmother for over a decade, spoke up for the first time that afternoon. Trevor, he said evenly, nobody at this table wants a scandal. What we want is documentation that matches reality. Right now yours doesn't. Trevor didn't have a response for that either. It was the first time I'd seen someone outside our family say plainly what I'd been thinking for years, and something in me finally exhaled. Then the review turned to my mother. The forensic team showed that she had approved Pinnacle's contract, despite an internal procurement flag, noting insufficient documentation, and had personally overridden the competitive bid requirement on 5 separate occasions. Worse, once my grandmother began asking pointed questions about Pinnacle roughly a year before her death, the accounts payable coordinator who had first raised concerns about the vendor was quietly reassigned to a different department within weeks. Then came an email, pulled from the company's own archived server, that my mother had apparently forgotten still existed. It was addressed to Trevor, sent 14 months earlier. Mom is looking too closely at Pinnacle's invoices. Clean up the descriptions and stop routing everything through the same project code. The room went silent. My mother stared at the projector screen the way you stare at something you genuinely didn't expect to see again. For years, I said quietly, you called me difficult for noticing small inconsistencies. Now a room full of professionals is looking at one of yours. My father was next. Records showed his digital approval on 11 flagged transactions, though system logs indicated 8 of those had actually originated from my mother's workstation while he was traveling. He admitted, when asked directly, that he had approved payments without reviewing supporting documentation because my mother told him they were time-sensitive. Did you understand that your approval represented a financial control? Melissa Grant asked him. Yes, he said. Did you perform that review? No. He said it quietly, and for the first time in my life, my father looked exactly as uncomfortable as the truth actually was. Trevor stood up abruptly. So what? You're going to blow up the whole company because Grandma had a grudge against me? You think I'm doing this because I like paperwork? I said. I'm doing this because a number didn't match, and I don't pretend it does just because I recognize the name attached to it. My mother said my name sharply, the way she used to when I was a teenager who'd stepped out of line. I looked at her and said nothing. There was nothing left to argue about that the projector hadn't already answered. The board recessed and returned with interim measures. Trevor was placed on administrative leave, his company card and system access suspended immediately pending the conclusion of the investigation. My mother remained CFO only long enough to ensure an orderly transition of financial records to an outside interim controller. Her signing authority was suspended the same week. My father voluntarily stepped back from approval functions while the board reviewed what the report ultimately termed serious control failures, distinct from personal enrichment. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Auditors substantiated that just over $94,000 in Pinnacle-related payments had directly benefited Trevor without proper disclosure, with additional amounts still under review. A separate finding documented $41,000 in expenditures my mother had authorized outside standard policy, though the accountants concluded those funds had not personally enriched her. Her exposure was procedural, concealment and override of internal controls, not theft. My grandmother's estate plan treated the two differently. Trevor's inheritance would be reduced by whatever he failed to voluntarily repay. My mother's unrestricted share depended on formally completing the governance settlement and permanently relinquishing executive authority at Callahan Freight. My father could receive most of his share once he signed the corrective findings and gave up financial approval authority for good. My own trustee authority was set to continue through the full 12-month review regardless of how or whether anyone else settled. Trevor initially refused to settle, and had his attorney threaten to challenge the trust for undue influence. That claim weakened considerably once Pinnacle's own owner, facing separate exposure, agreed to cooperate with the company's investigation in exchange for resolving civil claims. Within days, Trevor's attorney reopened settlement talks. He ultimately repaid just over $60,000 through a combination of personal funds and a reduction to his inheritance, resigned from the company entirely, and agreed never to represent himself publicly as speaking on the company's behalf again. The company did not collapse without him, which turned out to be the most damaging fact of all to the story my family had told itself about how essential he was. 2 account managers absorbed his client relationships within a month. The board hired an outside CFO with no family ties. Procurement controls were rebuilt from the ground up. 6 months later, operating margins had actually improved, because the company had stopped approving vague, undocumented spending simply because a familiar name had signed off on it. The board also created an employee advisory seat on the governance committee, strengthened anonymous reporting channels for staff, and required independent review of every vendor contract that involved a related party. Those changes mattered more to me than anything with my own name on it ever could have. It meant the next person who noticed something wrong wouldn't have to wait for a will reading to be believed. In the weeks after the settlement, an old family group chat resurfaced during the document discovery process. Messages my mother had sent over a year earlier, describing me to relatives as someone who loves feeling important, and was feeding Grandma's paranoia about the business. Trevor had replied in the same thread with a nickname for me I won't repeat here. Reading it should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it clarified something. They hadn't simply overlooked me for 20 years. They had actively mocked the parts of me that made me useful, until I learned to make myself smaller. I forwarded the relevant messages to Trust Counsel, because they reference company matters, and left it there. I never posted them anywhere. I wasn't interested in becoming careless just because they had been. My parents are still married, but something between them shifted permanently. My father stopped smoothing over every disagreement just to keep the peace. My mother quietly withdrew from 2 community boards where she'd enjoyed being seen as the flawless steward of the family's legacy. Nobody forced her out, she simply stopped wanting to be in rooms where people might ask why she'd left the company. Trevor moved out of state and took a sales role somewhere with no family name attached to the building. We haven't spoken since his settlement closed. I kept my job at the trucking co-op. That confused my mother more than almost anything else that happened that year. She assumed the whole point of power was to use it to become someone important. My grandmother understood me better than that. I never wanted a corner office or my name on a door. I wanted decisions that could survive being looked at closely, and for 20 years that was the one thing my family had never valued in me. On the first anniversary of her death, the attorney handed me one last envelope Grandma had asked him to hold until the review concluded. Inside was a single handwritten line. If you're reading this, they probably called you cruel for refusing to make their problems disappear. Keeping peace by hiding unfairness was never peace. It was permission. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I used to think staying quiet made me the reasonable one in that family. I know now that silence is sometimes just the space where an unfair system gets comfortable enough to keep going. Money can buy comfort for a while. A title can create the appearance of status. A polished reputation can persuade a room for years, right up until someone finally puts the actual records on a screen. None of those things can manufacture real accountability, and none of them can replace the simple, uncomfortable relief of being taken seriously for exactly what you noticed and exactly what you did. My mother spent 2 decades deciding who counted as family based on convenience. In the end, the only vote that mattered was the one my grandmother had quietly arranged a long time before any of us realized the ballot existed. If someone spent 20 years treating you like you didn't matter, and then suddenly called you family the moment they needed something from you, would you give them another chance? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because there's always another door somebody tries to close.